Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Adam.
Hmm. So, we were talking about a lot of things last time. Many different live issues. One of them was relationships between empowerment and curiosity framings, and also the origins of empowerment. What are the minimal systems, and how and why did it first come about? But we went in many different directions. It just depends what's of interest today. Or someplace completely different, whatever inspires.
Well, we can ask a number of questions here. We can ask ourselves, for example, what is actually the reason that we are able to organize our world? For example, people talk about segmentation as if it's a self-understood concept, and we talk about goals as if it's a self-understood concept. We talk about and language has also this structural thinking. The question is really, why does that actually happen? Why do we find this? Why do we keep finding, especially temporal structure, but also other structures, as a integral part of the cognitive processing and possibly of evolution? If we look at evolution can be quite modular. If we look at the evolution of certain genes, some of them are quite modular in thinking. And so this is one of the questions that I think is important to answer if we want to understand how complexity can be accumulated, if I may say so. So one of the things that we have to think about is, where does this complexity not only come from, but how is it able to organize itself? And we have to ask ourselves whether arbitrary amounts of complexity could organize themselves just cumulatively without any such intermediate steps of, let's put it this way, focusing. So in continuation of what we talked about last time, namely, where does, as you say, empowerment, where do we get the complexity from, and all these things. The question is actually, how is it that we can manage complexity as even in evolution? Now, I do think actually quite elucidating is not evolution, at least not biological evolution, but actually the consideration of the evolution of human artifacts. And if you look at human artifacts, you see that in the early phases of a new technique, there's a proliferation of things that people try to do. And this proliferation very soon stops, and then it boils down to some principles which get repeated, possibly copied. If successful, they get modified, replicated, and buried. So we see designs of certain type of things which may depend on, first of all, discovering that you can do that, and then finding out how you would do them well. And then if they are of limited complexity, you get still a big variance. I mean, if you have, for example, an early axe, then you find better and better axes with the time, and then there's a refinement, then you simplify. But sometimes when you accumulate complexity, it doesn't work like that. And then things actually need to be reorganized from time to time. And that is actually a process that I find extremely interesting. So if you look, for example, let's take software. Software is an excellent example. When people started writing software for computers, then they started with assembler, then they decided assembler is not really manageable, and they have these primitive computer languages, and moved on to, for example, something like Fortran. And then they came to actually quite early, relatively abstract languages like Lisp, for example. Lisp was surprisingly early. It's 1960, if I remember correctly. But
is that the list of lists language?
Yes. Yes. In fact, some people have a joke that Julia, which is a very modern language for numerical processing, and quite an elegant language in many respects, is actually a Lisp. In many aspects, it has, although it doesn't look at it like at all, but it has borrowed many ideas from the logic of Lisp, or how it's being constructed. However, with all this, turned out that actually writing software systems is a much nastier undertaking. So you started writing these systems, they were super intricate, and they had this real brilliant programmer that understood every in and out of a program. But the programs grew bigger and bigger and bigger. At some point, they were not manageable anymore. This was a software crisis. If I remember correctly, I think its heyday was in the 70s. So in the 70s, essentially, people started writing software packages that were so big that they went just not manageable.
To the accumulation of technical debt that eventually just keeps you from being able to move forward. Eventually, it's an impasse of this hairball spaghetti code system.
Exactly. It's unmanageable. And you can't actually do anything with that. And
that was me about a week ago.
Sorry?
That was my spiritual situation about a week ago.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, things like that do happen. And what you then need to do is simplify. Okay, to every Cambrian explosion, you need a Permian extension in a way, right? So you need something to streamline what you have, to clear up the backlog, and as you say, to pay off the technical debt. I actually like the term very much, because the technical debt is something that grows exponentially, but at different interest rates. Okay, so essentially, you always accumulate it, but if you have a good system, it accumulates at a low rate. Still, at some point, you will have to pay it back. And the solution is, of course, software engineering. So you find ways to organize your software, develop APIs that make essentially the API independent from the content, and not independent from the content, not independent from the semantics, but from the precise way you have actually handled the solution of the code. Now, the interesting part about that is, if you look, for example, the history, and I'm mentioning on purpose because we understand the history of software much better in a way than the history of the evolution of structure, because we know, of course, the intention behind software, and we do not actually know kind of the, let's say, the battle plan of evolution in a way, because there's no agency that we would like to attribute to it. So in software, for example, if you look at windowing systems, it's really fascinating to see how that evolved. If you look at the early windowing systems, they were incredibly complicated. If you look at X Windows and the later Motive as a window manager, it's horrible systems in the sense of, not horrible in the sense of organization, they were quite clever and very, very general, very powerful, very abstract. You could do everything. Right? They had thought of everything. The X Windows system was absolutely amazing. They thought about how to open a window on the different machines. The internet didn't exist then, right? There was no thing like, nobody thought about the internet. Nobody thought about, and they already had a protocol for doing that, having different machines showing windows from other machines, and how to control events and where to put them, and how to make sure that you can plug in all kinds of entities on your window and manage them. They essentially had object orientation long before it became the big thing to do, and they implemented it in a very, very, very basic way, but it was object orientation. It was there. The problem is, doing that is quite core chore. So you really have a long time of getting this abstraction down to actually do something. And with time came new ideas of how to do this, and how to organize events, and how to manage window systems. And you can see that in the manuals. The manuals suddenly started shrinking, right? So there was a phase where the manuals of X Windows is something like, a couple of manuals, and then it started shrinking. You found this really clever windowing system where the manual was suddenly just 50 pages. You could actually read it in one session, and you knew how to do stuff. So what I'm saying is that what you're trying to do in an evolution of a complexity accumulating system, you try to simplify, and you have to do that regularly to keep control over the system. And as you do that, the paradigms may shift, and you start forgetting about things that you don't actually ever need. The funny part is things start coming back from another side, and they look like, oh yeah, you always wanted to do that. And there's actually a nice example on that. Again, I'm talking about evolution of software, because that's probably the clearest thing where you can see that. That's, for example, there was, as I said, you can open multiple windows on different machines, and you have something like Emacs as an editor, and that could open the same file on different windows. And at that time, that is many years ago, at that time, people thought, no, you can't work two people on one document. You can't do that. And today it's complete standard. Nobody actually even thinks about the protocol that you need to do that. At that time, there was no protocol. The protocol was, this was the same buffer. You would both write into the same buffer, and that was perfectly fine to do. Now, the phenomenon of accumulating complexity and simplifying it and making more transparent, accessible, that phenomenon appears a lot in technology. And I do think possibly it also appears in evolution, right? That's why we're actually talking about this. So in other words, once a principle appears, that principle may be lost, but in many cases, not always, but in many cases may reappear again, be rediscovered and re-evolved, and possibly in a way that makes it open to further evolution.
So an initial period of more undirected free exploration, almost like a kind of babbling, where you're building up this complexity, finding different purchases on the world, different affordances,
yes,
grips, but then a few might find in a kind of co-constructive process, a few will end up being particularly valuable. But because there's this organic process by which they arose, it might be a fairly heavily entangled and low evolvability attractor network. And you need to somehow anneal it and pull back and break apart to these dependencies, that this debt, this optimization that's built up just from the search and discovery and the complexification process. And then the goal, though, of simplifying for refinement and getting certain virtuous cycles involved. Like I'm having a memory of, like you were giving an example before, of like the discovery of like a longbow technology, where all of a sudden you can hit a target, and then now this created its own separate process of demand was created, which then furthered the supply. And I'm butchering it, but
no, I think you're actually summarizing it very nicely. Yes, exactly. You create a target, and this target suddenly becomes a value in itself. Not really, of course, on the long run, but in terms of the short-term search, that's what it does. So you can forget about the rest. You can concentrate on this one target. It becomes a focus of its own, and that actually segments your path. And this segmentation allows you to explore paths much more efficiently than if you had to really look for all combinations of all paths across all possibilities. You can then now combine a partial path with other partial paths later, and don't have to explore the whole space. So sparsity is no longer an issue.
so now you have like compositionality and now you can work with the combinatorics, is like leverage them for
Exactly.
different
Exactly. You suddenly have the possibility to explore much more efficiently, because the individual components are much easier to find. I mean, the standard problem is, of course, cracking a safe. Crack a safe, and you have to find actually the whole code. And if you don't get the whole code, you can't open it. It's much harder than if you have some kind of combination where you hear a click and a second click and a third click. So each click gives you part of the solution. It's much easier to do than if you had to turn a huge wheel at the exactly right spot, because then you would have actually to search through all the solutions at once and hope you find the right one.
This has to also be a model of cognitive development.
It's quite possible. I mean, there are, without hints, without hints, I don't think we would have evolved a major brain. The world has a lot of hints for living and intelligent organisms. The world is very, say, helpful in guiding us to good solutions. I mean, people would probably not immediately agree with that or say, well, the world is not nice to us. Actually, the world is comparatively nice to us. I'm not saying there's really nice to us. I mean, bad stuff happens, but physics is friendly for intelligent life. At least it seems to be, assuming we have passed the big filters that may have been on the way. We have no idea where the big filters are, to be honest, right? So the big questions, for example, of evolution of higher intelligence, nobody actually knows where the big filter lies. Some people think it might be moving from prokaryotes to eukaryotes. Some talk about multicellularity, but that seems not to be the big issue. So the move from prokaryotes to eukaryotes might be one. Could be even something entirely different, right? So, you know, the dinosaurs lived for a very long time, and you know, they lived fine. It was perfectly fine, right? And that's not assuming that they actually went to office and and did bureaucracy and stuff like that. There's this, of course, this joke where they walk with a bag and then try to shop and then work in offices and so on. This is, of course, caricature. We have no idea whether they did that, but assuming they did not, then they essentially could have gone on for another 100 million years easily. So they were killed, and that created a big evolutionary pressure, stress, and jump forward. And also our precursor, I think it's Homo erectus, they lived for 2 million years. That's a long time, right? So maybe it was some event that created the stress that made Homo sapiens make the step ahead towards higher levels of intelligence. I mean, there's this bottleneck 70,000 years ago, and you know, that could be a candidate. I mean, there is even a possible candidate event. So basically, there seems to be some kind of small star that passed our solar system, possibly at that time, and maybe that actually created some kind of asteroid and meteorite fallout. But then this is purely speculative. What I'm sorry.
But something turning up the heat and pre-existing solutions that might be stuck at local optima have limited evolvability because of the organic process might not have created the sparse structure that it's a lot of entangled dependencies, but then something comes in and basically shakes up the previous regime, sparsifies it for you, or just clears it out such that just clears the playing field. Something like that.
I think it's more than clearing the playing field. I think life is actually at that stage already more active than that. I do think when you impose stress on organisms, there's enough, let's say, life experience or evolution experience in organisms that they will really now think, okay, I could live an easy life up to now. You know, if everything's fine, you can live an easy life. But when you put up fire up the stress, they know, okay, I have to do something to survive. They now actively look for ways of finding better niches, of getting unique, I wouldn't say selling points, or unique evolution points, UEPs, if you like, where they can carve their niche that makes them safe or safer from competition, from danger, from other species, etc. So my argument would be that it's not just shaking up, it's not just simulated, not just annealing that you would have in physics. It's much stronger than that. The moment you put stress on living organisms, they know, okay, I have to do something for my line to survive. And that is not just a bit of random search. That is really looking, okay, how do I get out of competition, danger and reach of other possibly dangerous organisms. That would be my hypothesis. Would be consistent with an empowerment view, by the way. I can explain that in a second.
But actually, agency and intelligence being part of it in terms of something of the Baldwin effect, like when learning guides evolution, but like it's not just shaking things up and then a new structure forms, but it's there's an active call to mobilize in a different way to handle the challenge. And then this potentially causing a different set of pre-adaptations or different set of selective pressures to be operative both at the level of the learning and the intergenerational optimization, something more that we're teleological and agency is part of the process of, in the face of stress, trying to handle that situation and not and actually being the seeds of a new kind of adaptation and optimization,
something like that. Yes, you have, I mean, there is an innate understanding of some aspects of the evolutionary space, right? So when evolution has gone on for long enough that we can assume that there is this information, right? I mean, Lenski's experiments, for example, with a snapshotted population of bacteria might indicate that. The point is that as an organism, undirected search doesn't get you very far, right? You just diffuse around your usual stuff. Organisms don't do that, I would say, or at least they don't do that predominantly. What they do that if they can afford to, but if you stress them, they really get away from there. You say, okay, let's go as diverse as we can. Yeah, I climb the mountains, you go to the desert, you go to the. It's not a decision that they make. It's drive of moving away from the state you were in, and you really don't want to go back because that's wasn't good, right? You were stressed there.
We didn't record this, but you were mentioning before with I don't know if it was E. coli, but basically they don't know exactly where they want to go in terms of the gradient. They're in some sort of aversive situation, but they do know that if they just make a straight line taxis, eventually they will be somewhere different.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it's a bit like Bakari Bonsai. Wherever you go, there you are, right? So
Tell me about it.
The motto is really, I don't know where I want to go. I don't want to be here, right? That's a statement. Now that's almost a very trivial statement, but I do think we can actually formalize it in the language of empowerment. If you look at empowerment and the projected actions that create your cloud of possibilities, if you like, the possibilities are strongly enhanced, or the actions that move you to the boundaries of your reachable space are strongly overemphasized. So the things that keep you at where you are, there are many actions that keep you where you are. You don't need to find, you have lots of actions, so you distribute the probability equally, and each of them gets a little bit, but because they're not really dominant. But an action that gets you really to the boundary of your space doesn't have many alternatives. There are few actions that do that, or perhaps only even one, say in a discrete case. And empowerment will put a lot of weight on that, because that is a state that you otherwise cannot reach. You can only reach it with this action sequence. And therefore, and this is all the hypothesis, if it's true, right? If it's a valid hypothesis, indicates that extreme actions that get you to the extreme points of your reachable space, are not only oversubscribed, but when in case of stress, these are the ones that are more likely to be selected, because these are the ones that will get you into a significantly different place, and they're not just filled by net neutral diffusion.
If you survive the journey.
If you survive the journey, absolutely right. Yeah, completely. But the point is, it is surprising how aggressive life can be in conquering new niches. And this would explain it. So you say, if there's no stress, you don't do that, right? You don't take risk if there's no reason for that. we know that if you look at, for example, utilities, there's a concept of risk averse and risk friendly. Now, let's take an example. The example is, say I do a lottery to you, and I say I'm giving you two options. You can pick option one, and that means you get $500 guaranteed. Let me see what I do. No, sorry, you get $400 guaranteed. Sorry, that's the way. The other option is I play a lottery. 50% chance that you win 1,000, and 50% chance you win nothing. So the average payout of the second lottery is 500. The other one is a payout of 400. Which one do you pick?
Depends how much of a buffer I have, and but
Normal person, say a student or postdoc or something like that. So you're not Bill Gates.
not Bill Gates, but if the wolf isn't at the door just yet, I would like to pick the $500 expected value lottery.
Okay, you'd like to. Okay, so you're actually prepared to take the risk. Many people say if they're not really don't care, if you have lots of money, you probably don't care. Will actually pick.
I feel uncomfortable with it, but that's what I think I should.
I see. I understand. So what you can do, for example, you can start testing how much less than the average are people prepared to accept, right? So if you give a 500 for sure, many people will take that, right? But when you start lowering it, more and more people will switch to the risky one. And the amount by which you lower it is kind of insurance you're ready to pay for having the payoff, the guaranteed payoff. So it's a bit like saying, okay, 400 means I'm prepared to pay 100 for insurance so that I guaranteed to get the money. 300 means I'm paying 200 for insurance, and so on. So this is a so-called risk-friendly one, and that's what people usually do when they are in a good shape. So when you make money and you're in in a situation where you kind of have a business and the business goes well, then you take things that are rather more safe than not. If you have a lot of money, and this is just a minuscule part of your thing, you're basically indifferent. Essentially, that's what standard utility theory says. I'm not going to talk about bounded rationality or say information-based utility skewing. I'm now talking just about standard utility. This situation changes totally when you go into desperation state. So if you owe $100,000 and then people offer you a safe payout of 30,000 or some very, very risky business where you can lose, I don't know, 200,000, but you might win actually 500,000, right? And so many people would actually choose the risky one because they're already in desperate situation. They're prepared to take the risk and further it. So they say, okay, I don't care. In other words, the risk profile changes depending on your outlook. If your outlook looks good, humans and it seems organisms tend to pick the risk averse one. If the outlook is bleak, they say, okay, let's just gamble. And in fact, I would actually propose, and possibly people have done that stress can be measured by this. So why I'm saying that is that stress forces organisms to say, okay, I have to take the risk. I go for to the boundaries of my action space of what I can possibly do. May or may not survive, but I will definitely not survive if I stay where I am. If that makes sense. That's a hypothesis here. So it also goes to show, interestingly,
This is,
also what, yeah.
This might not be the same thing, but one thing I was just noticing is in the basal ganglia, like action selection system, one thing, I'll have to look in the details to know if this connection holds any water, but the direct pathway for initiating actions also traffics in substance P. And I'm wondering if like there's some sort of like common significance there, like usually a pain, like in the periphery, it's a pain signaling molecule of tissue damage. And this is actually like directly energizing action. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering if that's some of the logic.
That is an interesting tidbit that I wasn't aware of. It would make sense. Yes, absolutely. If there's pain, you need to move. You need to change something. Something's wrong. You have to act.
Yeah.
And of course, if a predator catches an animal, they will fight and will try to do something. Because not doing anything, unless it's really death.
Things are dire. Things are dire. Like
things are dire. Sometimes playing dead is the thing that you choose to do, but this is then also a reaction that must have had some success, otherwise it would not be used. But if you are essentially caught fighting for your life, it's usually a good idea. You might get away. It increases your chance of getting away. It's actually a good point what you say. And note one thing. I talked about the evolution of mammals after the dinosaurs. I mentioned the stress on humans. Maybe that was the kickstarter of language or of culture. I have another one which I really like, and that is the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age, which is a very interesting transition, because the Bronze Age was actually, late Bronze Age was a very rich time. Countries were rich, cultures were rich, and then you ask yourself, how come Iron Age was so poor? Actually, it started out as a really civilizations were in a bad shape. And basically, there was a big collapse. Reasons for that are in dispute, but there was a big structural collapse of civilization. Many civilizations collapsed. The Egyptians was probably the only one that held out, and barely so. So Egypt just about survived the Bronze Age collapse, and it was never as powerful again afterwards. And the interesting part is, after that you have Iron Age. Suddenly there was a technological advance of really significant kind. You had the formation of larger empires. Not just Egypt was an exception, but most of the empires, they were empires, but city-states, kind of unclear exactly how it looked like. But suddenly empires were much more centralized, much more focused, much more structured and organized. So I do believe, actually, when they
is this
say
like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, or around what time is this? Or?
the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age collapse is 1200 BC, so 3,200 years, roughly this time, right? So basically, Iron Age probably starts around 1000 BC.
I see.
Right? That's roughly the time. And we see really the emergence of a new structure of society, new structure of state, new structure of state ideology, the rise of the what you call the real ancient empires, not just loose connections of cities. Egypt was an exception, but most big empires started then only. And I really find it very interesting. It's like the term forged in fire. I don't think it's an empty word. Stress is a focusing event. It creates a pressure on an evolutionary or a complex adaptive system, I would claim, to find other ways of keeping alive or keeping going. Can be also individuals.
I think William James called it being twice born.
Yes, in a way, yes. If you survive, though.
If you survive.
If you survive.
If you make it
right?
through the flames.
So I'm not a proponent of the things, yes, that's what we need and whatever. What I'm saying is, it is what can drive progress. If you survive. And it's not something we should wish for. It's not something we should seek. But we should understand, when that happens, this is what we need to do. This is kind of the way to look at it. Because stagnation is also, people talk about stagnation like it's a bad thing. Actually, it's not a bad thing. Stagnation means, well, you can afford to stay as you are, and that's fine. The problem with stagnation is always when you don't see the technical debt or other types of ecological debt or evolutionary debt accumulating.
So this, it seems like this could apply to like punctuated equilibrium models of evolution, and also like some stage models of like cognitive and emotional development, potentially in terms of like some sort of precipitous phase transitions, but also like if under this stress, cybernetic systems are seeking this edge of their state space. And is this also like, is there some correspondence here to like what's the Kaufman's notion, like the edge of the adjacent possible? Like you're actually poised in a place where you're so you're poised at the place where novelty is actually possible, or not sure.
I mean, that's originally the thought of empowerment, right? One of the many motivators for empowerment was understanding what is the edge of chaos, or what is it that actually you are looking for. Now, I have now changed my opinion. I don't think organisms actually look for the edge of chaos. They don't like chaos at all. They want to control the chaos. If I'm master of chaos, that's fine. I don't want others to create chaos. I want to be the control of chaos. I want to be able to do it, right? If I want to. But you want to be poised on where novelty is possible. And where stagnation doesn't work is when you forget that. You start forgetting that your job is always stay at the top of things. Doesn't mean that you have to mess them up, but you should always be able to react to them. You should always have, let's call it contingency plans, basically, whether evolutionary or as an individual or as a government, a country. You always need contingency plans. When you start not paying attention to them, then you will pay the price. You're accumulating evolutionary or adaptive debt. And that is actually that's why I really like when you said technical debt. This is exactly what you accumulate in a way. So in other words, the problem is not that you are stagnating in the sense that you just keep doing what you're doing. If that works, if you have a company that has a good brand and the brand sells and you don't have to change the brand, why change it, right? Everybody's happy, you are happy. You change the brand, people get upset at you. Why change it, right? Only when you start failing to see that the brand is being eroded, then you start actually being in danger of stagnating. So stagnation per se is not a good measure of whether you're successful. So you don't change. I don't know. I mean, you don't have to change. When the basis for your success erodes, that's when you start accumulating that. And then, of course, if you can see that ahead of time, you're in a better shape. And that is, in my opinion, where usually natural organisms are not very good at, and also many societies are not very good at that. They act when the stress comes and they are, oh, okay, we have to act on this. Few react before it happens.
So if you let yourself be complacent and stagnate, that could work if you're, for a time, if you're in a highly protected, cloistered garden environment that you could just rely on to always be there. But if you have not basically pushed yourself to the edge in different ways in a more exploratory fashion, and you're not building up this repertoire of contingency plans, if the walls of the garden fall, you might
exactly.
then you'll find that your complacency was not what you wanted ultimately. Yeah. It's reminding me a little bit of
exactly.
I have a collaborator who works on personality and cybernetic models of personality, Colin DeYoung, and he has a framework he calls cybernetic big five theory. And he interprets like this combination of basically the shared variance of openness and extroversion. He calls it plasticity. And the shared variance of conscientiousness, inverse neuroticism, and agreeableness, he calls stability. But the idea of like they're in this dynamic tension where it's like the plasticity one is this active process of seeking the new, reconfiguring, complexifying your policies, going out, and that's and so it's, stability acting as this conservative force, plasticity is an exploratory force. One could undermine the other, but both need each other. And that if you lose one, if you're not sufficiently stable, if you don't have like a stable base to move from, you can't be particularly plastic and exploratory. But in a world where things are changing, if you don't have this active open-mindedness and seeking out of the new, you may not be stable for long in a world of change. Like you'll be brittle. So
Exactly.
This could be a multi-scale story.
I completely agree. I mean, you get it on every level, and that's kind of a pattern you see on every level. But the point here, can you hear me? It's a little bit shaky, I think.
We had a glitch in the matrix, and then
let me know if it gets interrupted. So the interesting part. Sorry?
The interesting part. I hear you now.
Yeah.
I'll reset my video. 1, 2.
Yeah, the interesting part about that. Yeah, all right. The interesting part about that is that if you accept that you don't want just to know the optimal location, the optimal niche, you want also to know its, to phrase it like that, tangential space, its virtual possibilities. And how does it look around this spot? Not just the spot. You want to know, how does the landscape look around it? So then you're not surprised. You know where you could go to. You know how it would look when you go to these locations. And I do think that this is something that some parts of the genetic code does know. So there is some innate knowledge of where you move to when you evolve somewhere else. And I do also think that this is something that, for example, when the people say contingency plans, that's exactly what it means, right? So you have a plan for when there's a fire, when there's an emergency. There are things in place that actually are prepared for this to work. And the better your contingency plans are, the less likely it is that you will actually be hurt by an emergency.
So to have the right, or to have an adaptive set of reactive dispositions, it's not enough just to know like where am I, like as a point estimate in state space, but like what's the local neighborhood likely to be?
Yes.
This like this affordance landscape surrounding me, and this would help to inform on some level the likely surround should be there in the operative set of reactive dispositions to wherever you find yourself. There should be some sort of additional sense of what's likely to be surrounding you.
Absolutely, yes. So the key is if the internet is back again, okay, it seems to be better now. The key is really that you have an understanding of the local structure of your space. You're not sitting on a point. And this is, by the way, also a very interesting thing. There's this famous observation that there are people who always successful in life. Everything succeeds, and at some point, failure begins. And they then can completely collapse. And the reason is that they know how to win, but they don't know how to lose, because they never have had the experience. They have no understanding how the landscape looks like. In other words, it doesn't have to be the case, but understanding how the landscape looks when you're not on the optimal, when you deviate from the optimal, is, I think, a core property that a resilient system needs to have. And I do believe it works in every level. It works on evolution level, cognitive level, cultural level. A society that understands how to cope with failures is a resilient society. I mean, old Rome, the Republic of Rome was, of course, a classic example for that. I mean, they handled Hannibal, which was really worst case scenario in a way, in terms of antagonistic forces. And they managed to handle that. That is, my opinion, only possible because the Republic of Rome had many setbacks. They understood exactly how defeats look like.
Could you think of play almost like a benevolent adversarial attack on your own policies to like help encourage that sort of return? Like, I don't know, like forcing yourself into unusual situations, like within a zone, you can still practice it. But like turning up, not necessarily like plunging yourself into the flames, but turning up the heat just enough that you're that practice of the return. Or
I mean, people do that with neural networks with other systems. So the adversarial idea is something that's being practiced. I wouldn't be surprised if nature actually does that, right? We see examples of you know, bears or lion cubs fighting each other playfully, but of course they train for the real case. We do have war games. I mean, it's all very serious background, but in the end of the day, war games don't end with the death of many soldiers. If they're done right, you just know, okay, this doesn't work, this works. I wouldn't be surprised if evolution is full of that. In fact, that you have lots of antagonistic trials. I do actually think that, for example, phenomena like PTSD, which is considered a mental illness, but I personally think it's probably an overexpressed training session. So where basically your brain is rehearsing very negative situations to respond better next time. And it's just simply gets out of control. But in principle, there's a good reason why it does it, right? It's not like, oh, the brain just doesn't do the right thing. It does do the right thing, just too much of it.
you would want to prioritize.
So, I mean, again,
I'm thinking like
sorry.
what was it, like prioritized replay models of like episodic memory, but like you basically, if something was aversive, you want to give yourself more exposure to it, and there would be even and you ought to be rewarded on some level for that, but they could become excessive, like you keep returning to it and you're just again and
Yes.
again you know, creating this gradient that you're then annihilating, but you keep creating the gradient and it's disruptive to other things. And so it's like, it's almost like a kind of like wireheading, almost even like a really unpleasant kind of wireheading. Like,
yeah, the point is, of course, you need to perturb it with actual events. You need to synchronize it with the reality. You have to plug into reality to make it sensible. But in principle, and again, I'm not a psychologist, so what I'm saying here is purely kind of from the perspective of systems theory or complexity theory. But I do think that adversarial training does happen, and empowerment in a way is semi-adversarial in the sense that it tries to push into the environment as far as it can, whether or not the environment pushes back. In reality, for example, we like things that push back because we don't like them, but we like to explore them. So when you're in an explorational mood, we do like to explore antagonistic things. We're not in explorational mood. When we're in exploitative mood, we don't. Right? I don't like to being accosted by somebody who wants to argue with me when I'm busy just getting some shoppings done. But if I'm in public argument about science and whatever, then yes, maybe I want that. I'm looking for a nice contrarian point where you can actually test the strength and validity of your hypothesis. Okay, my time is, I think, running out for today, so it might make sense to wrap up with a few short remarks, if you don't mind. I really apologize for the short time today, but not always.
I would rather keep you, but some is better than none. And I don't want to keep you. So.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Well, yeah,
No, I think there will be to talk more.
I mean, I think we made some good headway. So, yeah.
Excellent. I will be delighted to talk about this or other things as you like next time. So
looking forward to it. So 1, 2.